Thank you all for being here. This is a remarkable opportunity. I'm honored to have been invited. This is a very amazing program and a very amazing lecture series. So I was asked before I jump into this, just briefly, the title here of what I'll be talking about today, restoring socio-environmental, indigenous socio-environmental systems. That's a bunch of words together, but really what I'm talking about is restoring indigenous relationships with the land and work that we're doing around that in the Bear River Basin. Before I jump into that, I was asked to briefly talk about career pathways that got me where I am today to the material that I'll be describing. And so I was thinking about this over the last couple of days and figured I wanted to do it by sharing some places with you. So the first place for me is the Pedro Coast of Central California. This is where I got introduced to anthropology as a discipline and archaeology as an approach for looking at the past. And we were working with indigenous Chumash communities on understanding their history and relationships with the environment. This is when I was an undergraduate. It really sparked my interest, took me away from a path that would have led to business, nothing wrong with business, but that's, took me into this area and really got me thinking about human environment interactions. I was then lucky enough to be able to go after some time off working in the private sector for CRM, cultural resource management companies. Was lucky enough to be able to go to graduate school at Stanford, where my PhD advisors, Dr. Rebecca Bird, brought me on to a project they were working on with market communities in Aboriginal Australia, the Band mentioned. And this was a complete shift in terms of the type of work because it was working with communities on environmental problems that were important to them, particularly thinking about how to quantify the effect of Aboriginal fire regimes on the landscape. So I had to get trained in field ecology and quantitative ethnography, a very different set of characteristics. But I think most importantly, got to meet a whole bunch of amazing people who taught me really the importance of listening to community and trying to build research programs around what the community really wanted to have done. And I took those lessons with me coming back to the US and taking a position at the University of Utah that was focused on Western North America and really trying to work with indigenous communities across what is the Great Basin and Colorado Plateau, and particularly up into the Bear River Basin that I'll be talking about today, and really working on projects that are structured and guided by community members. And through this process, again, a whole bunch of different skill sets I had to learn, a whole bunch of different things I had to pick up, because it wasn't my research agenda that was pushing things, it was questions that people were asking. So I had to figure out, well, what tools do we need to help answer those questions? What other experts do we need to bring on to this team to make that work? And so I guess my point when I was asked to talk about career pathways, just through my own trajectory, is to highlight that anything that you learn is something that you can leverage to learn more. Listen to community members, keep learning, and don't let the idea of learning something new be something that stops you. Let it be an invitation to go and experience and gain more expertise. I, for one, have learned more since completing my PhD than I had before that. And I hope that that's the case for all of you to go on in your life, whatever it is that you do. Now, the last place I wanted to share with you is a bit closer to home, and that is the shores of Massachusetts. And the reason for sharing this is because as a descendant of the settler colonists that came here in 1620 and landed on these shores, I recognize that all of the experiences I've talked about getting up to here are coming from a place of privilege, opportunities that were essentially given to me at the expense of taking away indigenous land from indigenous people. And we all live on indigenous lands. So this is a map of native languages across North America. This is by Goddard. If you haven't looked at it before, take a look at Native Lands Digital. It's a great resource that shows you indigenous lands so you can search where you live and what lands that you're on. Now, this map I'm showing to you because I'm coming from the land, the unceded land of Chumash people, to here, the colonized land of the Massachusetts tribe, and everywhere in between. All of this is indigenous land that was taken away. All of this land that was dispossessed from communities. Recently, Farrell and colleagues tried to quantify the impact of this, and I think it really drives it home. You're talking about a 99% loss of land compared to what land tribes have today. And this is through a process not only of just land dispossession, but forced removal and genocide. And in the end, if you compare environmental characteristics about the lands that tribes inherit today, we're talking about places that are hotter, drier, and with less mineral resources. And again, many of these places are also not traditional homelands that people called home before colonization. And there are also lands, there are also many communities that don't have land. Now, not only are we all living on dispossessed land, but we also all deal with the environmental consequences of that dispossession. And I'm going to give a couple of concrete examples for what I mean about that. The first is across the plains, the historic slaughter of bison, which was actually in part motivated to take food away from indigenous communities, is something that led to the transformation of prairie lands, the degradation of landscapes, overgrazing, and ultimately contributing to the Dust Bowl and a whole bunch of environmental consequences that we experience on those lands today. Similarly, the exclusion of indigenous communities from woodlands across Eastern North America, or all of North America, but particularly in Western North America, led to a century of fuel buildup over policies of fire suppression. That's one of the major reasons, in addition to anthropogenic climate change, that we're experiencing catastrophic wildfires, particularly across the West, but in the East as well. So these are consequences of disconnecting indigenous relationships with the land. And that's because I argue that what we're looking at are ecosystems that evolved in people for thousands of years. These ecosystems were things that were responding to and adapting to the decisions that indigenous people were making. And if you remove indigenous people from these interactions, there's going to be ecological cascades and consequences that are still unfolding today. But this is not a doom and gloom situation. In fact, I would say the opposite. I would say that we are all here living in a really unique moment in our nation's history where things are starting to turn the other way. And particularly thinking about the reintroduction of bison through indigenous-led organizations across the plains and elsewhere, all the way to places like Utah that I'll be talking about today. We see the emergence of these new prairie grasslands that are getting restored through indigenous-led management and restoration. It's also providing opportunities for increased food sovereignty and increased sort of cultural recognition of these important practices. Similarly, the return of cultural fire across the forests in the West, and here's a couple examples from California, are helping to increase fire breaks, reintroduce new ways of managing lands, and also allowing these amazing cultural resources in terms of plants and the animals that rely on them to return to landscapes that they haven't been in for a long, long time. So again, I think this is a unique moment in history. Those are just two examples. But this is part of a broader movement about indigenous-led conservation and restoration. It's one that centers indigenous knowledges, beliefs, and practices, and one that builds equitable partnerships to advance indigenous goals. Oftentimes you'll see it phrased as braided science, two-eyed seeing, or indigenous ecology. But in these contexts, really what we're talking about is centering these relationships and really trying to understand how to foster and rebuild these connections with the land that benefit not only the environment, but also people and socio-environmental systems. What I'm referring to here in the sort of modern problems of convergent science is really the same thing as saying bringing back indigenous relationships land. So what I want to talk about for the rest of my time today is a specific project that I have had the honor of working on for the last several years. And it's one that is restoring these dynamics in the Bear River Basin, which is a major drainage basin that connects, that runs across the states of Wyoming, Idaho, and Utah, and drains into the Great Salt Lake. Now, this project is centered at the site of the Bear River Massacre, where in 1863, between 400 and 500 men, women, and children were murdered by the U.S. government. This is one of the largest massacres in U.S. history, and one that is often not told. This land was taken by settlers, water was diverted, and the land was converted to farming and ranching. But again, in a moment of what I would say is optimistic hope, in 2018, the tribe, the Northwestern Band of the Shoshone Nation, who were federally recognized in the 1980s, were able to buy back this land. They are the direct descendants of the survivors of that massacre. And they were able to repurchase this land and were able to start helping to restore and rebuild these ecosystems. Under the leadership of Vice Chairman Brad Perry, this project has been taking on a lot and I just want to read this quote from Brad here, and I'll keep revisiting it through the talk. And that is, I want to take this land back in time to when it was wild and restore our connection to it. If you Google Brad on this project, you'll find a whole bunch of other amazing interviews and quotes. And he will say things like, this is about cultural healing. This is about reconciliation. And it's really about opportunities for the community to reconnect to the land and turn it back from what it has been, kind of relatively sterile rangeland, into an ecosystem that their ancestors would have recognized and enjoyed. He says, we're going to turn it back into a happy place rather than a place of mourning. So to do this, the tribe has convened a remarkably diverse team of individuals across disciplines ranging from anthropology to zoology and everywhere in between. And through this process, the community is really leading this effort and bringing all of us together to work towards this project of restoration. This has gotten a lot of media attention, not only for the story that it is in itself of amazing triumph of the community, but also because of the ecosystem services that this restoration effort is providing to the broader region. So as I mentioned at the beginning, the Bear River is the largest contributor to the Great Salt Lake. You can see its watercourse here coming in the high Uinta Mountains, which is a major mountain range, draining down, dumping into Bear Lake, or coming out of Bear Lake, and then taking this U-turn up here and draining into the Great Salt Lake. This is important for broader conservation purposes because not only is this just an important ecosystem in its own right, but it's also home to the Bear River Migratory Bird Refuge, which is one of the few bird refuges that's sitting both in the Pacific and Central Flyway. So you can see located right here. And water is critical for maintaining these migratory routes of these important birds. And also, as the largest contributor of water to the Great Salt Lake, the Bear River and restoring the Bear River and water that flows into it is critical for people living in the urban areas around Salt Lake City. Because as national media has picked up on, if the lake dries up, you're going to have about 1 million people that are going to be living in toxic dust clouds as they blow off the lake and across the city. So again, this is important for the community, but the Indigenous community is also providing lessons and actual services that benefit everybody. And we'll return to that towards the end here. So what I want to highlight is, this is kind of a status update on where the project is right now, what we have been doing, and kind of wrap it up with a point for future directions at the end. To start, I want to highlight one part of Brad's quote here, which is to take this land back in time. And that is one of the things that we've started doing because there's a lot that's unknown about this ecosystem and what it was like prior to the 1863 massacre, and particularly for the thousands of years before that the tribe was living there. And so we've convened a team that are experts across a number of different disciplines. First, we have people that are experts on modern climate and also forecasting future climate change, as well as paleoecologists and climatologists who are able to reconstruct past environments through sedimentary records. This is the Jen Watt and her students. She's a geographer and is taking a core from the site right here along the edge of the Bear River. And this is the first set of cores that are done here so that we can actually understand what the environment was like prior to the massacre and also how rapid change was historically post-massacre, and thinking about how that change can be reversed. We're also working with wildlife specialists. This is Utah State University Professor Eric Lamalfa here, setting up one of many game cameras and acoustic monitors that are all over the property in order to get a sense of what animals are on the landscape today. And then we're also turning to museums. This is Casey Cole and Tyler Faith. And they're looking at some paleontological collections from nearby caves at the Natural History Museum of Utah to get a sense of what mammals diversity and abundance were occurring through time. And then most importantly, we're also working with the community to get a sense of oral history, what the oral documentation, what the historic documentation is, and also to build archaeological records of land use change through time to really get a sense of what was going on. And as we tie all this together, we're not just interested in reconstructing a static moment in time, like this species was here then and not here then. That's of course important, but really what we want to do is recover these relationships really get a sense of the dynamic interactions between climate, plants, people, and animals. Because only if we can understand and basically build models that describe those relationships, can we then forecast them into the future under expected climate change scenarios and say, hey, at 2 degrees warmer, at this much less precipitation, what animals can still survive here and what needs to be done to make sure that all of these interactions can actually be maintained. So through this process, I also want to highlight that we've really been focusing student-led opportunities, and this involves embedding students that are in courses like environmental justice, indigenous communications, wildlife resources, and an intro class into scientific research. All of these students have engagement with community members. They're in the field, they're working in archives, they're working in laboratories. They're taking all of this information and presenting it to each other. They're also taking this opportunity to go into the field. Here's a bunch of students from the environmental justice class that are going out to plant willow trees and cottonwood trees. And then perhaps most importantly is that we're constantly engaged with communication with the people who are leading the project, the tribe themselves. So off to the left here are 2 symposiums that the tribe hosted at their tribal offices. And we have students giving both oral and poster presentations to tribal leadership and community members, where we're actually really having the best opportunity, I think, for having this dialogue and feedback and being able to build better research. And then the thing that really excites me is here's Brad actually taking some of our research and presenting it. This is a bit meta. Let me stand just like Brad. We have Brad here at the 2024 Salt Lake Watershed Symposium, where he is taking a map of archaeological sites in the Bear River Basin that my PhD student Ishmael Medina put together. And what he's doing is explaining the indigenous history and explaining some of the research that we've been providing to help understand management of watershed resources. So skipping to that very map, what this map shows is first synthesis of archaeological history. And we also have all the historic documentation. We have a number of historians that have been going through archives. Those data are also available for where the historic villages were and where European settlements came in. And what we're able to do here is then start to build a better sense of the different types of animals that were living across this landscape in the past. We're really focusing on cultural keystone species as defined by the tribe. So as elders say, this resource is really important for us, this resource is really important. We're really highlighting those. There might also be a question of how do we look at water quality in the past? So then we're taking indicator species such as these bivalves that we can find at archaeological sites and do things like stable isotope studies to get a sense of what water was like in the past. We're also focusing a lot because of the importance of eagles and other raptors to the community as a cultural keystone species. And also to waterfowl, because this is of direct interest to the migratory bird refuge and the work that they're doing in trying to promote the persistence of these birds as they migrate through the area. And then we're also looking at things like greater sage grouse, if you're not familiar, is a major threatened species occurring in the area, and also all sorts of mammals such as the threatened bigworm sheep that are also important to the community. And so we're using these long-term archives of archaeological, paleontological, historical, and modern observations through citizen science, such as you can see on iNaturalist. If you take a photo of a bird with your phone and upload it, we're taking all of that information as well to try to then get a sense of what are the dynamic interactions of all of these factors through time. And again, what I'm going to share with you now is really preliminary. This is a status update on the project so far, but just to share with you some of the findings. This plot, for example, is mammal species richness. So this is just the number of different species, if you count them up, that are occurring through each 100-year interval, moving from 2,000 years ago on the left to 20 years ago on the right. And what you can see, this is looking, that our record actually goes further back in time. So I'm showing you this dashed line. So that's the long-term average of the number of different mammal species that are occurring across the landscape. And you can see that there's a general increase in, this is one measure of biodiversity. So there's a general increase in biodiversity through time up until the time of the massacre when you see a sharp decline and then perhaps a rebound in the most recent century. So what we're looking at already is a long-term record of actually increasing biodiversity through Shoshone land use practices, and then a decline following the removal and attempted genocide of Shoshone people, and then a rebound under modern conservation efforts. We can also do the same thing and actually just count up the number of Shoshone settlements that are occurring at any one of these century intervals as well. So basically counting up the number of camps that you can see on that map that are occurring under any one period of time. And this is what that distribution looks like. And again, you can see perhaps even just eyeballing it, that it seems like there's a correlation of more Shoshone people on the landscape, greater biodiversity, greater species richness. And so again, getting at the sense we really want to understand these relationships. We've been doing some preliminary modeling. So in this case, we're looking at the number of mammal species on the y-axis, the density of Shoshone settlements as an indicator of land use intensity on the x-axis. And when we fit that with a statistical model, we see that there's a positive association. We've also been running, for you stats nerds out there, been running a whole bunch of resampling routines, and also making sure that this isn't just a bias of more sites, meaning more of both things. And we're also looking at the areas of congruence between the periods of overlap to make sure that it's not that different records have different amounts of suggestions. So a whole bunch of things to nerd out about if you want to talk to me later about it. We can also then dive in and look at particular species that are important to tribal members and elders. So for example, this is looking at species prevalence. So the number of sites where we see a particular taxa occurring. So do we see it at all the places where we have evidence for it, or do we just see it at a few, or do we just see it at one? And here I'm just, instead of going by century, we're just looking at the archaeological records. So prior to 1800, through the historic archives that are the 1800s to the early 1900s, and then through the modern observations, iNaturalist and all that kind of. And so you can see, for example, black bear. Here is a just gradual decline of black bear on the landscape through time. You can see beaver. Beaver were really important during the fur trapping industry, and so they almost were extirpated completely from this watershed, but they persisted, and now actually beaver restoration is one of the major targets of a lot of the conservation communities, conservation organizations in the watersheds across a lot of the West. And so you can see beaver have a nice rebound in the more modern period. Wolverines, they actually disappeared entirely. And then there is one wolverine that showed up in this record and made news headlines and all that kind of stuff in the recent past. So that's a wolverine coming back into the record. And then the pattern here with bison, which again are one of these primary cultural keystone species, one of the most important food resources for community members prior to the massacre. And here we see the decline of bison to the point of being completely extirpated. And in fact, the only bison that are living in this area at all today are a completely managed herd on Antelope Island, that's in the Great Salt Lake. So thinking about them, what is it? We can take a look at any one of these taxa and try to get a sense of how is it that their history is tied to both climate and what people are doing, Indigenous people and Europeans. So taking bison first, and this was at the request of the tribe as the most important cultural keystone species for us to look at, we've been trying to really rebuild an understanding of this history of bison, and again, its relationships with what's going on. Now, the first time I showed this slide to an audience afterwards, a colleague said, you got to get a photo of bison that's much closer. This is that bison herd on Antelope Island. One of our former master's students, who was the park manager at the time, sent this to me. And he would want me to say, no, you don't get closer to bison. That's how close you get to bison. So do not get closer to bison. That's your public service announcement for this talk. But you can see them off in the distance there. And what we've done here is just a more extensive example of the kind of work that I showed already, and where we're bringing in records of paleoclimate, trying to think about how that's affecting vegetation, looking at that land use history of Shoshone through the example that I gave before, and then also bringing in the number of European settlements that are moving into this watershed And all trying to get a sense of during any one period of time, do we see bison on that landscape or not, as a function of all of these other factors, as well as the interaction between these factors. So thinking about how colonial land use is driving down indigenous land use through processes of massacre and genocide. We also understand that when it might be a wetter, nicer climate, there might be more vegetation that's drawing in people as well as bison. So we're working on this by tying all of these different records together into a fancy machine learning model that is designed to basically find patterns in the record through all of these relationships. And then that allows us to do things like present counterfactual scenarios. Well, what would happen in the future under this climate regime if we wanted to try to bring bison back? What else would we need to do? So just going to show you a few of the results here. These are what's called the partial response. This is just in the model speak. If we isolate only the target variable and we say, how does the probability that bison are going to be on the landscape vary as a function of that variable? And so here we're saying, let's take a look at precipitation. And there's a real positive association. During wetter times, you have bison on the landscape. During really dry times, bison go elsewhere. With summer temperature, you can see the exact opposite response. When temperature is colder, bison are having a good time. When it gets way too hot, bison are not around, they're going somewhere else. Now, when we bring in the human component here, it would probably be no surprise to any of you to see, once we see colonists coming onto this landscape, bison just drop to near zero. They don't drop all the way to zero because there's still a probability that they might be around, but this is again through active measures of basically trying to kill off all bison to remove food sources for communities that are out there. And then we see the opposite pattern with Shoshone land use, and that is when there's more Shoshone on the landscape, there's a higher probability that bison are going to be on the landscape. And we again tried throwing a bunch of things at this to make sure this isn't some type of sampling or autocorrelation or anything like that. And it's a real pattern. And it's one that when we presented it to elders, the response was, of course, there are relatives. We care for them through practices like burning vegetation to nurture grasses. That's going to be important for them. They fertilize those grasses. It is, as an ecologist would call it, co-evolutionary dynamic. It is one in which the bison are dependent on people and people are dependent on bison. So now if we take that model and we say, hey, I want you to predict what happens through time. So here we've got that same response of the probability that bison are going to be on the landscape. You can think of this as if you were to go back to 8,500 and look out on this landscape, what's the probability that you would see bison hanging out in this area? And so when we take this and we ask the model to make a prediction here, I want to highlight two important moments in history. First is when Shoshone adopted horses. Horses were introduced into the region by Spanish colonizers coming out of New Mexico. Some horses went wild and traveled all over the place, and several indigenous communities adopted horses in this area, including you and the Northwestern Band of the Shoshone Nation. And so this is the approximate period that they adopted horses, both for transport and for hunting. And then the second dash line is the earliest European settlement in the watershed. And so when you plot this out, what you can see is essentially hundreds of years of sustainable bison harvesting. This means that throughout this period of time, you have Shoshone populations that are increasing, decreasing, people moving around, doing all sorts of different things, and they're reliant on bison the entire time without having a negative impact on bison. And this is important. This even persists through the period of the adoption of horses, which many have argued, hey, people were already overhunting bison once they adopted horses. So trying to be like, it wasn't Europeans' fault. No, it was Europeans' fault. And particularly, you can see here, through this period, it's not a coincidence that you see a sharp decline coincident with the arrival of the first European permanent settlement in this watershed. And that's again because of active measures to try to destroy the local bison community. So we didn't go through all of this process just to train a quantitative model to tell us what we already knew, although we did learn that bit about looking like this is a very sustainable practice. what we did it for was to try to, again, get at these counterfactual scenarios. So to try to get a sense of what would have happened to bison if, for example, Europeans never built settlements there. So if we actually just ask the model, remove European land use from this landscape, but still tell us what it would look like under future climate change, this is the result that we get. We can then say, well, what happens if Shoshone land use never went away, if it just stayed persisting at those levels? And you can see here, even higher probability that bison are going to be on the landscape because of that positive relationship between people and bison, that management, those relationships of relatives. And so what this really tells us then is that if you want to reintroduce bison to this landscape, you also need to reintroduce indigenous land use practices. It's not something that you can just plot bison down and think that they're going to be doing just fine. You actually need to care and tend for them in the ways that Shoshone were doing prior to European colonization. And I think this is an important point because it's not just for bison. You already saw that there's a positive association between just enough of the biodiversity of mammals and people in the landscape. And the point being is that if we really want to restore these ecosystems, we also have to restore the relationships between people in the landscape. Again, as I said at the beginning, this is because these ecosystems co-evolved with people. And so it's no surprise then that this is the result. And as Brad said in the quote we've returned to a couple of times here, he really wants to restore the connection to it. And as I mentioned from other quotes, make it a happy place again, a place of celebration. And so in the last part of the talk here, I just want to go through a couple of examples of work that's being done on the ground and how just the action of doing this is starting to return these relationships to the land. So to start, the tribe got in there and started immediately removing invasive species. Russian olive, or a tree that were planted by ranchers, is a windbreak. It's also a really, really thirsty tree that sucks up a ton amount of water, more than the native plants, willows and things. And so far through water monitoring, what they're noticing is that by removing huge stands of Russian olive, just on this 400 acre parcel of land, the tribe is returning about 13,000 acre feet of water to the Great Salt Lake every year. And so one of the questions we've been looking at is, well, how can we scale this up? So one of our students in the geography department is working on a model that can automatically identify Russian olive through remote sensing, and then be able to provide this information to other landholders up and down the watershed and saying, look, these are all these Russian olive trees. If you remove them, this is how much acre feet of water you can return to the watershed. And there's actually all sorts of other incentives, conservation incentives for those landowners to do that. In a sense, trying to demonstrate a process through which the lessons of the Shoshone restoring this ecosystem can be applied more broadly across the watershed. This is an amazing site. This is a pond that the tribe from the very beginning wanted to restore onto the land. Prior to the massacre, this landscape that you're looking at right now would have looked like this, with braided streams coming in and gently going into the Bear River, and not just a big fenced off pasture. And so this is a huge step in returning some wetland ponds. It's also the hope that the endemic Bonneville cutthroat trout will return to these waters. They do live in streams further up, and be a place where elders can come and fish and teach their grandkids how to fish and all of that. And some of the biologists from BioWest, one of the companies here that's working on the project, has already noticed an increase in water quality and an increase in the number of waterfowl that are occurring across the landscape. So already having these broader benefits in ecosystem services, increasing the quantity of water, the quality of water, and the land available for these migratory birds. And then finally, in the idea of returning relationships to the land, through this process, through the amazing generosity of the Northwestern Band of the Shoshone Nation, they've invited so many of us to come onto this project, to work with them, and to spend time really making this a place that we all appreciate. So again, you see the students here from Environmental Justice. They're out for the annual tree planting day. And here, this is the most recent tree planting day in 2025. There's Brad on the back of the quad, telling some jokes, getting the community excited. It's really just an incredible thing because it's returning this land to a place of joy, to a place of celebration, and in the process providing an amazing opportunity for education and restoration. Okay, so really what I just want to highlight, this is one example of what I was saying at the beginning, is a broader movement across North America and across a lot of the world, where Indigenous-led conservation and restoration are providing opportunities to really return ecosystems, return the relationships to them that co-evolved with people. And through this process, I think, again, I gave some other examples of this happening across Western North America, but again, it's a broader movement and one for all of you students that I hope you're interested in participating in. It's something that I think we can all learn from, and I hope that this has been a fruitful lesson for all of you. Happy to answer any questions that you have about anything. Thanks to the team, and thanks to all of you for being here.
Hey, thank you so much for a wonderful, wonderful lecture. We definitely have some time for questions, so I will open the floor, see if anyone wants to ask a question for Brian.
Thank you. That was beautiful and very information dense, and so thank you for so many things there. I really appreciate right at the end you were touching on the role of non-native landholders and kind of like adopting Shoshone practices, and then also the generosity of the tribe in terms of bringing other people into this project. I was wondering if you could talk kind of more broadly about how the Shoshone think about, you know, the role of people who are not members of the tribe, but are working toward trying to restore those types of relationships, and kind of how that interacts with the tribe's role.
Thanks. Yeah, I don't want to speak for Brad or the tribe, but I would say based on things I've heard him say is that this has been an example of demonstrating what the capacity is of the tribe in a leadership role. And I know Brad is now an extra busy person, even busier than before, because he's being invited to come and speak at every single thing that would be related to this. And you know, he's even on the what was it, the committee that's preparing for the Olympics. You know, they're coming to Salt Lake City. And so there's I think a moment here where this demonstration of capacity has really been able to leverage and grow. And it's also been a great opportunity that now there's been even more private landowners in the watershed who are going, oh, well, I just inherited this ranch. Can I give it to the tribe? Can I sell it to the tribe? So there's actually now increasing opportunities for additional land back, that land return that I think are again being fed out of both the publicity about this, but also the demonstration of success in this case. Again, the tribe is leading this, and so it's an opportunity for, I think, a lot of the people who are in the conservation space or in the academic space to be taking instructions from the community. And in some cases, that means academic researchers learning how to sit in the back seat as opposed to thinking that they're in the front seat. So I think that, again, this is what I'm hoping is all part of a broader movement within this space. That's not just a blip. This is one example of many, and I think we're all trying to be better and really appreciative of the opportunity to work with the community on this.
Just curious, were the species you shared the only ones that you tracked in this project, or were wolves involved by any chance and things like that?
Yeah, those were not the only species tracked. They're geez, I get so excited because so you have a bunch of students in the lab that are working on everything from archives to animal bones, and then also working with the camera traps and all that kind of thing. And so you have this amazing team of students that are, whatever archive they're working on, get really excited when they find something rare or interesting. And so we have a few examples of some of the first species that are documented in this area. There are wolves from Smithsonian. We didn't know wolves were there, but there are some wolves. I'm forgetting, there's one little fold or something that had never been found before. Students were thrilled they found 1,000-year-old. It's not old. Anyway, so there's a whole bunch of different texts. So the ones I focused on today are the ones that the tribe requested, basically, in order, can you start with bison? We really care about eagles, we want deer, and so we're kind of working in sequence. And the idea is, this portion of the project is currently funded by the National Science Foundation. And we're in our final year of that grant, and it's still in sort of compiling data. And so I think it's gonna be years more until we get to the final, not even the final, but the next major update where we're able to actually query essentially the workflow that I showed with bison. We want to be able to say, what species do you want to look at? Great. And go turn to the computer and actually have it all ready to go. And you can just select through an interface and it'll pop up and give you that history and those types of relationships.
Terrific talk. And let me say, I have the utmost respect for people, Native Americans, who are, trying to go and get back and do things like this. But it also occurs to me that, the winter in Wyomings are notoriously cold.
Yeah.
And does part of this kind of, getting back involve camping trips or even more extended living on the land the way their ancestors do? Or how does that kind of work from their perspective?
Yeah, I think you brought up how cold the winters are, and I'll highlight this this massacre site was a winter village when the US Army marched on it. And the reason that this was an aggregation location, you can see perhaps just a little bit right there, there's some steam coming up. This is a hot spring that's actually bubbling into the Bear River itself. And underneath all the land, like where I'm standing, where I took that photo, across all the land underneath is all part of this geothermal warm area. And so the reason the community was camped here and the reason it was such an important winter site that they return to year after year is because the warm, the land was so warm, it created a pasture where grass was still available for their horses, where animals were still coming. And this is why it was such an important winter village and an aggregation site for community members. In terms of spending time back on the land, I think community members are always out hunting. They're always out spending time fishing, doing things when they're not involved in restoration and, this particular work.
That was a great talk. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you.
I want to chat with you a little bit afterwards, but I'm thinking about why you have so many more mammals on Shoshone, and my hypothesis would be that much of the landscape you described in the watershed looked like it would have been forested, and then it got cleared by the actions. And in moderately disturbed sites, you always end up with higher biodiversity than extremely disturbed sites or older sites. And so, but it made me wonder, like, to what extent does the plant pollen data, any of that history suggest that there were more willows, there were more grasses, there were, like, how can we make the connection? And then I'm thinking that once you get bison on there, then you also get the nutrient cycling and better water infiltration, which makes for better water quality. So then I'm thinking about dung beetles.
Yeah.
And so if you could tell us a story of how you connect this to understanding sort of the feedbacks in the system.
Yeah, thank you so much. Yeah, that is exactly what we're hypothesizing and hoping we'll be able to support with some of the evidence. The team, Jen Watt and her students who are working on the environmental course, bless them. I don't know, for all you environmental studies students, do you guys like microscope time? Some? Yeah. All right, I've got a job for you. I can't do it myself. That's not for me. But so we've got this team of amazing students in the School of Environment, Society, and Sustainability at the University of Utah. And they are going through slide after slide of charcoal and pollen and everything else. And so the hope is they did several cores across this landscape, and there's some other regional cores as well. And so we're actually hoping to tie all of those together and get a sense of what's a regional signature of a different vegetation structure and change over time. what's the regional fire record through charcoal, and then be able to dive in and say, where do we see global departures, especially in the landscapes where camps were more active, villages were more active. And the sense is, yeah, and that's also what elders said. So this is about us burning the landscape and tending these willows and these important plants that were for food and basketry, and then the process that were more animals. And so, yeah, exactly, those feedbacks. So we're work in progress. Yeah, thanks.
One thing I was kind of wondering about is, I think you mentioned it a little bit, you talked, but, is how is the project and I guess the kind of idea of restoring past landscape, how is that being understood in a modern setting where we do have, like human caused climate change, continuing to make the environmental conditions different from the conditions of that past landscape, and how is that being factored into the way that indigenous populations are being understood and
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. Yeah, one of the benefits of having a really long-term record that's not just the last several thousand years is we also capture a much greater range of variation in climate. Now, we are definitely going into an unprecedented period of climate where it's going to be warmer, drier, and with all sorts of freak events like we haven't seen before. But we're getting closer to capturing that longer term record. So the way that we're doing this is in an analytical sense, leveraging that broader range of variation to then train statistical models and machine learning models and deep learning models so that we can actually say under this future predicted climate or this envelope of climate from this to this, based on what we saw in the past, are we likely to be able to see these species occur or not? And already some of the preliminary work suggests it's unlike there are some species that are just not likely to be around. So we might be outside. In particularly, if you're thinking about bison, it looks like bison would actually be okay, but bison also need a lot larger area to range than this particular set of acreage. So if you're returning bison, they will need to be fed and that's supported and that kind of thing. And then there's other species that are really temperature tolerant, so they might be too hot. So the goal is to build this broader framework, and then that way we can actually predict what are conservation targets that we can actually meet. We're also really interested in thinking about what are I've been using cultural keystone species, but there's also ecological keystone species. And you could also think of them as kind of amplifiers for restoration. And that is what particular species do we see in the record that when they occur, they co-occur with a bunch of other really important species, and then trying to get at what's the function of those particular species, can they persist in the future? And if we really prioritize reintroducing or supporting them, such as beaver, how then does that have a cascade that helps to reverse the last several hundred years of environmental degradation?
Thank you so much for your talk. I really enjoyed your presentation. I was wondering, you spoke a bit about how you and your team have been using like scientific and like historic archives to kind of reconstruct like the environments and ecosystems around history. I was wondering if you can speak a bit more how you adapted oral histories or indigenous record keeping as well to help like inform you of the histories of this region.
Yeah, thank you. The tribe is leading the historic and oral history portion of the project, and so there's one of the great things is I'll come with the plot, like what I just showed you, the bison history, and talking to elders to comment and be like, okay, well, we know that this happened at this time, and it shows that there, or this happened at this time, and it doesn't happen there. So a lot of it is the oral histories are helping to validate because those we know are true, and people are keeping good records of those, and so trying to get a sense of are what we're finding is that in alignment with the oral histories and these historical accounts and records of the community. So we're doing it that way, and then we're also incorporating these. We're trying to set the basic unit for the species interaction. All the analysis that we're doing with that, the basic unit is just the species occurrence, and that is, does a species occur in a place or a time And we're then using any type of record, archaeological, paleontological, you snap a picture with your iPhone, whatever it is, we know that there's a species occurring in a place and time with some amount of uncertainty around that time and space. So the oral histories as well, when there's documents saying, interviewing people from about 100 years ago and saying when they saw the last bison on the landscape and they have stories about how harsh that winter was. And, so we're trying to incorporate both contextually and to provide that sort of historical element to it, but also you can say, well, that's also a species occurrence based on the last bison at this moment.